Thank you very much, Heather. Welcome, and I'm very happy to see everybody here today. My name is Glenn Easton, and I'm one of the organizers of the David Neufeld Lectures. I come from Whitehorse, Yukon, but I currently live in Saint John, New Brunswick, also known as Monoquest, on the Woolstick River, also known as the Saint John River. This is within the traditional territory of the Wolastoqey. And this is an area that follows a region that falls under the peace and friendship treaties. And given the kind of the virtual nature of this lecture here, I would like to encourage everybody, and wherever you're joining us from, to kind of reflect on the land that you're on as well. So thank you for coming to the 2026 David Neufeld Memorial Lecture. For anyone who doesn't know, David was a historian for Parks Canada and Whitehorse, and he passed away in 2020. He was one of the most helpful, welcoming, friendly, and generous people I've ever known. So many people have told me how he sent them research ideas or changed the way they thought about something, or found them in the archives and insisted that they come stay at his house. David was a remarkably open person. He was open to meeting people, open to both easy and difficult conversations, and open to learning new things. I know he especially learned a huge amount from Tondaquechan citizens and from their heritage department. David loved the Yukon, and he loved stories and storytelling. After he passed away, his daughter Erin and four historians who he mentored, including myself, started an annual lecture in his honor. The lectures are always free, open to everyone, and available afterwards on the website of the Network in Canadian History and Environment. This year, we would also like to acknowledge the financial support of two donors: St. Mary's University Department of History and the University of New Brunswick St. John Department of History and Politics. I'm now honored to introduce our two speakers for this year, Crystal Fraser and Jess Dunkin. Dr. Crystal Fraser is a historian and Indigenous Studies scholar at the University of Alberta whose work centers on Indigenous histories of colonial schooling, oral history, governance, and community-driven research in the Canadian North. She is the author of but By Strength We Are Still Here, Indigenous Peoples and Indian Residential Schooling in Nunavut Northwest Territories, and co-author of the national bestseller Talk Treaty to Me: Understanding the Basics of Treaties and Land in Canada. Crystal scholarship and public engagement were recognized with the Governor General's Award for Scholarly Excellence in 2025. She leads survivor-centered, community-engaged projects that support public education, Indigenous methodologies, and truth-telling grounded in Indigenous knowledge systems. Dr. Jess Dunkin is a settler historian and writer who has lived in Yellowknife on Treaty 8 land since 2015. Jess is a full-time staff member at the Northwest Territories Recreation and Parks Association from 2015 to 2020. She continues to work with them as a project manager of How I Survived, which is the project that she and Crystal will be talking about today. She also coordinates the Petroleum Histories Project on behalf of the Sawtoo Renewable Resources Board and supports the Lutzakel, sorry, the Lutzakel Dene First Nation, Dene Indigenous Protected Area. Just as a researcher associated at Aurora College, an adjunct professor in the School of Kinesiology, Sport and Recreation at the University of Alberta, and author of the book Canoe and Canvas, which came out in 2019. Crystal and Jess will be speaking today about their research project and podcast entitled "How I Survived," and it's about recreation, residential and day schools in the Canadian North. Thank you very much for joining us, Crystal and Jess. So I'll pass things over to you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for that introduction, Glenn. It's super nice to be here today. Do you want to say hi, Jess?
Hi, Jess. Just joking. Sorry, I had a throat bubble and I was trying to get rid of that. Good morning, everyone. Really lovely to be here as well. Thanks for having us.
So today we're going to be talking about the How I Survived project and the How I Survived podcast. Um, and Yeah, I'm coming to you today from Treaty Six Lands. I live just outside of Edmonton. I don't think I put that part in my bio. And I appreciate Glenn reminding us to think about the lands on which we live a little bit more deeply. The other thing that we need to think about as we work through this content, and I'm sure this is not new to many of you, but how to look after ourselves as we go through these harder histories. We know that in Canada, more broadly, we live under historically a system of genocide. And so this is just a reminder to look after ourselves not only through the presentation, maybe you need to step away for a moment, but also afterwards. Sometimes this content can actually be compounding, especially if there's other work that you're undertaking that is related. So a couple of ideas for later on might be to go for a walk after the presentation, call a friend, and of course, we should never feel shame to show our emotions either.
Thanks, Crystal. Um, Crystal and I are here presenting to you today, but we are part of a much larger team that has been working on How I Survived since 2018. And in particular, this work is guided. The project was designed and its evolution has been guided by an advisory committee. So we have 5 members. Lorna Storr is an intergenerational or a survivor from Aklavik, also a longtime educator. Dr. Sharon Ann Firth is a survivor as well, who's from Aklavik. But now lives in Canmore. And you may recognize her name. She went to 4 Winter Olympics, I believe, as part of Canada's Nordic ski team. Paul Andrew is a survivor from Tulita, originally in the Sahtu, but now lives in Yellowknife. He was a longtime CBC broadcaster. Amos Scott is an intergenerational survivor from the Clicho region who now lives in Yellowknife and is also a filmmaker and storyteller. And Rebecca Gray has ties to Pensacola First Nation, Wrigley, but now lives and is doing their PhD at the University of Alberta, so lives in Edmonton. And so this group of people is here with us in spirit, if not in body, today.
Yeah, fantastic. So let's get right into it. It's so exciting to have already published the first season of the How I Survived podcast, which came out in October 2024. And one of the very special people that we worked with was Agnes Kuptana. She sadly passed away last summer. But Agnes's words and story in episode 6 of the podcast, um, we often return to as a way to not only frame the project, but also think about the kinds of complexities that exist within these stories. So I'll invite Jess to play that clip now.
Agnes, I asked you a whole bunch of things that we wanted to know. Is there anything I didn't ask you about that you want to share with us?
Was there any hope back then? Was there any love back then? I did not see that when I was going to school. There was a lot of abuse. But somehow We're there for each other. When we see a child crying that's been abused, we don't let them be alone. We take them, we sit down with them. We don't ask them questions. We just hold them till they are ready to say something and say, let's do something. Let's go for a walk. Let's go see an elder. Talk to them from distance. Because you have some elders that have some houses far from the residential school area. And they're outside, always outside doing something. So even if we didn't have sleds, we try to go sliding, maybe go run hide and seek. That's recreational, trying to get something going to make them happy again. Because they were happy children, but when they go behind closed doors somewhere, they come out hurting. And we don't let them be. When you turn something around and want to do things, you make them smile and they start to laugh and they want to join. They forget about it. But sometimes you hear them crying at night, middle of night, because what had happened, they're dreaming about it. It's fearing them. I went through all that. I've seen all that. But trying to put happiness and laughter and do fun things, turn things around. And that's recreation. Maybe hopscotch, maybe baseball, maybe prisoner base, hide and seek, long run, however you want to play things that away from the group that was maybe at the kitchen, dining room. If they're in their own place and they're doing things among themselves, then that gives us free time to get together.
For me, sports was so important in residential schools. Otherwise, I wouldn't have, because I really had problems.
It wasn't just all sports for us. Sometimes you can just go maybe pick flowers or go pick the bear.
Wonderful. So, there's just so much, what's the word? Humanity and joy and also pain in what Agnes has said. She said so much in a short period of time there. The way that children used sport and recreation. She said recreation a few different times. While institutionalized at residential schools in sometimes very carceral and violent conditions. So we offer Agnes's words not only as a way to point to this complexity, but also as a larger marker of the How I Survived project, because this is really about centering survivors' voices and experiences. And that is another reason why we always share clips of the podcast pretty early in the presentation. So now I'll hand it back to Jess.
Yeah, so we just wanted to give you a brief roadmap of sort of where we're headed this morning. Crystal is going to talk a little bit about education and schooling in the North, just to provide some context for talking about the How I Survived project. So it makes a little bit more sense. And then we'll talk about the podcast that grew out of the project. And then we'll spend a bit of time reflecting on what we've been learning as we've been listening to survivor stories about recreation at residential school in the North. And then we're going to tell you a little bit about a new sort of sub-project that is growing out of How I Survived, and that's an art exhibit at the end. So I will turn it back over to Crystal to provide that historical context.
Fantastic. Thank you. So, one of the ways that we've also grounded the project is trying to broaden and understand, or broaden our understanding of what education looked like before mission day schools, before Indian Day and residential schools, because we know there is a difference between education and schooling. And so what did the education part look like before the arrival of newcomers? So there was really a focus on family. A lot of times, multiple families could travel together. There was a focus on stories and storytelling. We're currently trying to revive this part of our culture. An emphasis on observation and listening. And so, for example, in the two different pictures here, the one on the left is um, on my home territories. That is Alistine Andre, who is, well, in my books, a famous anthropologist, and her niece, my cousin Lisa Andre, and learning how to catch that coney fish, to cut it and clean it and hang it and dry it and smoke it. This is part of the model of observation and learning, as we see in the color photo on the right from not too long ago. Practicing these skills alongside each other, getting feedback, getting critiqued, and having the willingness to improve on your skills. And this was all done on the land in really an intergenerational way. There was no one dedicated teacher. Children learned from many different people over the course of their entire lives. Quickly moving forward, we do know, of course, that colonial schooling did have a devastating impact on our people. In the North specifically, we had the first day schools in 1860 and 1866, and then, of course, the first residential school in 1867. And really, the colonial schooling, the day schooling project was a mixed project. It was sporadic. I mean, the churches, the Christian churches, and in the North specifically, they were the Anglicans and the Roman Catholics, often offered half-day programs. If the missionary left the community, there could be no schooling for many months or weeks on end. Sometimes missionaries also traveled around to families' fish camps and whale camps. So this is all to say that, like, even the first day schools were pretty sporadic. Then we had the first residential school, as I mentioned, which you'll see 1867, which came before the official Indian Act in 1876, which is now known as kind of the framework for genocide in Canada, and residential schools being managed under the Indian Act. So before 1950, as I mentioned, there were some mission schools. There was a focus on work and church, and so similar to other places in Canada, they often functioned like industrial schools with this half day program, just a couple hours in the morning, and then the rest of the time would be spent making sure the residential school can operate. And this includes harvesting ice in the winter for drinking water, getting logs and wood in order to fuel, in the summertime, gardening and looking after livestock, etc. We also know that during this time period, like the first basically 100 years of colonial schooling in the North, there was fairly uneven attendance at these residential schools. That happened for a number of reasons. I mean, a lot of people would consider these places remote, and so staffing, was an issue, but there was also sometimes little oversight from Ottawa. Indian agents were not always present in the communities in order to enforce Indian Act or residential school policies. Some parents were successful at just straight up not sending their children, of continuing to live in the bush and on the land in order to protect their kids. But kind of on the other scale of that, we also see children in this time period travel thousands of kilometers by boat and steamship away from their homelands to be institutionalized. So there was still devastating effects on children and families as a result of these policies. Things shifted after 1950. We know the influence of the Second World War, particularly in the North, increased conversations about Arctic sovereignty, about the role of the military in the North, both Canadian and US. And we also know that Canada was being asked some humanitarian questions. At an international forum, they were straight up asked, how are you treating your own Indians in Canada? And then they came to sort of this realization that, well, not great, but we've also forgot about Indigenous peoples in the North. And so these multi-factors came together in this post-war period. And what this resulted in, one aspect was an explosion in a focus on constructing schools across the North. And so this was a way to bring Indigenous peoples, quote unquote, into modern Canada, to give them the supposed tools that they needed in order to enter the capitalist economy, and in order to bring new settlement to the North. And so this was a period of extensive school construction. We saw Grolier Hall, Stringer Hall, Acacho Hall, the big, large three residential schools in the North. Each had a capacity for over 250 children. They were built and opened in 1959. We also saw the construction of smaller residential schools, which the government tried to benignly call halls or residences, but we know that they operated like residential schools. We do know that there was a greater emphasis on academic and extracurricular activities. But there was new oversight. There were new checks and balances in the system. There was dedicated efforts made in order to bring children out of the bush into these institutions. And so while we saw the number of schools expand, we also saw compliance expand as far as attendance went. So here we just have a couple photos from the archives to show some of the early schools. We also know that during this period of colonial schooling, there were a variety of institutions, and it's really important to remember that not each residential school functioned in the same way. So it was really dependent on who was operating the institution, if it was Roman Catholic or if it was Anglican, the time period in which it operated, the location of the residential school, the proximity to children's homes, how far they had to travel, but also literally even just a change in administration. So if there was a new principal who came in, new student supervisors who came in, that could drastically change the experience that children had. So a wide diversity of how children experience these institutions, but at the end of the day, despite that, we cannot deny that these residential schools, Indian day schools, and I also have to say, all of the other institutions that were similar, such as Indian hospitals, orphanages, receiving homes, psychiatric institutions. These places were designed to separate our ancestors and relatives from our lands, to sever the speaking of Indigenous languages, to break up families and relationships among siblings, all in the name of expanding settler capitalism and trying to instill this idea of Euro-Canadian Christianity. Okay, so Interestingly, the North has a little bit of a different story, and I pointed to that, within the post-war period a little bit. The longevity of the system. We had the residential schools that operated for the longest period consecutively, 1867 to 1996. We know that Grolier Hall was one of the last two residential schools to close in 1996 alongside the Gordon Indian Residential School. We also know that the schooling system was being expanded in the North when it was actually shrinking in the South. And so I sometimes talk about a special committee that was struck in Ottawa to pause enrollments on residential schooling, to rethink the system. This was in 1947, yet if you remember, in 1959, these huge residential schools were opened in the North. We also know that Inuit children were particularly affected because of the long distances that they had to travel. Also, some of the most vulnerable communities were in the Eastern Arctic regarding tuberculosis. And so, if a child escaped residential school, they may have still been sent to Ottawa or Winnipeg or other locations for medical treatment for years at a time. But what we also know, and this is maybe not as unique to the North as we suggest, is the persistence and advocacy of parents and communities for their children, that they never gave up fighting. They were always trying to work in the best interest of their child. They were talking to elected officials. They were writing letters to newspaper editors. They were constantly trying to be in communication with their children. So a story of oppression and genocide, but also a story of persistence and strength.
Thanks, Crystal. One of the reasons that we often, and by often I mean almost always, start with that historical context is because this project emerged in response to an awareness of the need for education around histories and experiences of residential and day school. And so presentations are an opportunity to do some of that educational work and help people to better understand those histories in the North, which, as Crystal said, are understudied and not as well understood outside of the region and even in the region. So the How I Survived project actually came about after a presentation that Crystal gave at an NWT Recreation and Parks Association conference in 2017. And the NWTRPA invited Crystal to present about recreation and sport at residential day schools in the Mackenzie Delta, so in the Inuvik area where the conference was happening. Because of recognition that the organization had a responsibility based on the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and also the passage of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So those two documents were informing how the RPA was sort of understanding its responsibilities as a recreation organization. Invited Crystal. The presentation was very well received, but also made clear the huge gaps in knowledge that exist in the region, even amongst survivors and intergenerational survivors of residential school. So the RPA and Crystal initiated this collaboration, started this project, and the broad purpose is to record, preserve, and share the stories of residential and day school survivors. So as we said early, this is very much about centering the voices and experiences of survivors of residential and day school. Last December marked the 10th anniversary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report being released. And that anniversary was both a reminder to us as a project team of all of the work that still needs to be done, but it was also an opportunity for us to reaffirm our commitment to undertaking this work. So, we often look at that date and think we've been working on this for 8 years, and yet it still feels like we are just scratching the surface, and we're still very much in the early stages. So we often get asked why recreation, why this focus isn't that narrow. Should you just be studying the residential and day schools more broadly? And the simplest answer is always that survivors told us that recreation was important to their experiences. It was an important part of how they got through those really difficult years that they were institutionalized, but it was also something that was used to try and assimilate them. And so recreation invites us to think about residential schools in more complex ways, to think about survivors' experiences or think of the nuance of survivor experiences. And as I've already said, it was also in response to gaps in our collective knowledge. So it's not just that people don't know a lot about residential and day schools in the North, but they especially don't know a lot about recreation at residential and day schools in the North. So this was what inspired this work and this project. We also often get asked, what is recreation? And for most people, it is a synonym for sport or physical activity. And while that was certainly a really important part of the ways in which administrators used residential and day school to reshape the bodies and habits and ways of thinking of Indigenous children, and was also a way that Indigenous children resisted those efforts. We understand recreation in much broader terms. So you'll see here that it includes creative activity like music, like art, physical activities. So we've got pictures of hockey here. People talk about basketball, skiing, social activities. So Agnes talked about getting together to pick berries with friends or to go sliding, or we see a group of children here playing pool. And then there's also, things like Girl Guides, Boy Scouts, cadets, drill. All of these are part of the range of recreational activities that were either on offer at residential schools or that children themselves engaged in when they were able to sort of carve out that time for themselves. The third question that we often get is, why is this project called How I Survived? And the person who was responsible for inspiring the name is one of our advisory committee members, Paul Andrew. At a really early committee meeting, he said, speaking about skiing in particular, but also hockey, that those two activities were how he survived. He said, how I survived. So skiing kept him connected to the land, gave him time outside, away from the residential school. And hockey allowed him to be physical, be aggressive, be in his body in a way that he couldn't in other parts of that, of his experience. And, we recognize that the I part of how I survived can be problematic. It can suggest sort of individual survival when we very much know that children got through residential school in part through the collective experience. Agnes talked about that early on. But it was such a poignant statement that Paul said. And again, we see this as an invitation to talk about the variety of experiences, the complexity of experiences.
Thanks, Jess. So now turning to the podcast itself, I mentioned that season 1 came out in October 2024, and it consists of 7 episodes. There is a first episode with Jess and I introducing the podcast, giving some historical background to this topic in the North. And then all subsequent episodes focus on the stories of survivors. Um, and the podcast is hosted by myself and Paul Andrew. And so one of us, either myself or Paul, have a conversation with each one of these beautiful survivors that you see here. So Russie Nashalik, Dave Poitras, Beatrice and Ernie Barnhart, Agnes Kuptana, and Dr. Sharon Ann Firth. And what we were trying to do was, it's important to invite people who want to talk about these stories. That's a good acknowledgement that still in Canada today, there are so many people who are maybe not ready, who are still on this healing journey. So finding folks who have shared their stories previously, who are kind of ready to share nationally and even internationally, which Jess will mention on the next slide. But also get a representation of across the North, not just at one institution, to have a podcast of men and women. And that has been tricky in the sense that it's really pushed our boundaries to think about this concept of the North, because even though we have the territorial borders and such now, that's not necessarily the way that students moved to residential schools, or experienced their time. So really encourage everyone to listen to an episode or more. Jess can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they're all kind of between 30 and 40 minutes. So easy to listen to in the car. We also know that some people have assigned them on syllabi and have shared the stories in that format as well.
And because of all of the ways in which the podcast is being shared, we've already had an amazing response. So we've had almost 3,000 downloads, which is incredible to us to think about. And those are global. So most of our listeners are in Canada and the US, not surprisingly, but we've had downloads from over 40 countries. And in addition to the podcast being available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and the website, there's a little plug to go and listen to it. We've also aired or streamed the podcast on Northern radio stations. And we are open to sharing the files with others who are interested in having them shared on their community radio station. So please don't hesitate to reach out. One of the reasons that the advisory committee decided that they wanted us to make a podcast was because of its accessibility, that it is something that people can just have on their phone or listen to on their computers, but also the files can be given to radio stations to air. And so the stories can be heard really broadly, because first and foremost, the people that have spoken to us, and you'll hear this again and again in the interviews, is they just want people to hear their stories and to understand what happened to them at residential and day school. This is me. I was like, I can't remember who's doing this slide. So we've already started work on season 2, based on what we heard from the stories in season 1, and then also getting together with our advisory committee and sort of what things they wanted us to really focus on and pull out of interviews and in the podcast. Season 2 is really going to focus on healing, cultural revitalization, and well-being. And so in addition to just people who've reached out to us wanting to share their stories, we've sought out some folks who work in that space. So Jean Erasmus is a certified counselor. And so, we wanted to be able to ask her to help guide listeners through some things that might be helpful for them in their own journeys to being well, to healing from either their own experiences at residential school or intergenerational trauma. Lila Fraser Erasmus is another person who does sort of healing and community work around residential school. And so this is very much, centering those themes. We've done 5 interviews so far, and we're hoping to do a couple more for season 2. We're sort of aiming for 6 to 7 episodes a season, and hoping to start to have episodes from season 2 out in the next few months. So we've started editing and are making progress on the season, which is exciting.
Okay, so now we're going to get to the podcast itself. And, I'm getting a little bit worried about time. So I think in the interest of time, what we're going to do is listen to a part of Beatrice Bernhardt's episode. And maybe I will ground it in a little bit of context first about why we selected this clip in particular. And so we know that looking at recreation can tell us a lot of different things. But in particular, we listened to this clip thinking about recreation as colonization and as discipline. So that can mean a lot of things. And so if we just listen with the ear about new activities, new bodily habits, new values, and gender norms, then we can kind of quickly move on to the next clip that we're going to share. So I will invite Jess to play that clip for us, please.
Do you remember how you spent your spare time in residential school?
After school, sister made us change. We all had white blouses and a black jumper. We had to change into jeans and a shirt. Then sister would teach us how to embroider. We would do that for maybe about an hour. We learned to do that sewing, like say in the wintertime. And in the spring and summertime, we did different activities there, but they were all scheduled, and every child did them, whether you were good at it or not. You still had to do it. And of course, there was also some time for homework. So everything went by the clock, everything. The only time you were allowed to run freely was when they let you go play outside on the yard. Then you were allowed to just run freely and play and be a kid.
Okay. I think I will hand it over to Jess now to play Dave's clip.
Yeah, so as we talked about, sorry, I have to actually get this one queued up. 1 second here. So recreation served many different purposes. So the clip that we just played focused on recreation as colonization, but recreation was also gives us a window onto children's creativity, onto connection with other children, and also connection to land. So I'm going to play a little clip from episode 3, Dave Poitras's episode, where we can hear those themes.
When you were at residential schools, were there spare times?
Yeah, after school, yeah. If you were little, like when I first went there, I didn't have any chores, but my charge was my older brother. He had chores to do and stuff like that. And when we played out, it was mostly just made up our own recreation. and winter came, there were a lot of hills around Fort Chip and really nice skiing. Pretty rough, but we made skis out of those old round barrel staves, just kind of rounded. So Brother Saru would give us a piece of leather and some screws, and we'd screw the leather on the sides, and we'd come bouncing down the hills like that. Funny we never got killed because it's all rock, but we really enjoyed that. Like it was fun. Yeah.
Dave's episode is a really difficult one. He experienced a lot of trauma in residential school and spent a lot of his life working to heal from that. But there's also these moments of levity, these moments of joy where you are reminded of him as a child, as a, what I expect was a rambunctious boy based on some of the other stories that he's told as well. And that's another reason that, we want to foreground recreation is to meet survivors as children, to see their strength, to see their creativity, to see the way that they cared for each other, as Agnes talked about early on, and also the ways that they maintained connections to their homes, to their families, to their land, and recreation was part of that. They might play games that they used to play when they were at home. They might play with friends. They might be able to seek out people that they knew from their home communities. Or as Paul did through skiing, they might be on different land, but they were still grounded on the land when they were out doing something like skiing.
Thanks, Jess. So we're just often always trying to center survivor voices in all aspects of this work, not only on the advisory committee, but the people who we reach out to. We have held a number of listening events around season 1. So the people who we invite in to share these stories. Here I am in Sigachik in October with Elder John Norbert in his home. We were recording for season 2. And so this ongoing need, even 10 years after the 94 calls to action, to center the voices and experiences of the people who experienced residential schools. And so through this work, we know that recreation has been central and not marginal. Like all residential schools, not uniformly oppressive or redemptive. The variety and complexity. I mean, we've just listened to a few minutes of a few different episodes this morning, and you can see that come through. How different it was for each person, and also the uniqueness of the North, the kinds of challenges that they experience, but also the kind of strength and collectivity that they talk about. Earlier, we talked about Agnes and listened to a clip from Agnes, and she is a special part of How I Survived, not only because of the episode, but we actually first met Agnes when we invited her to submit, not submit, but create some artwork for the podcast. And so the advisory committee had envisioned the creation of a drum that could represent the various different aspects of the project, but also the things that were present for Indigenous families before and after residential schools in the North. So this on the left here is actually Agnes's creation. It is an Inuvaluk drum, and you can't really see in the digitized version, but this is sewn and embroidered. It is fabric. It is kind of like this huge fabric felt. Well, I don't actually know if it's felt, but like a fabric drum that we have had framed, and it has become the logo for the first season of the How I Survived podcast. And Jess was actually in touch with Agnes as they were creating this drum. But from what I understand, and maybe Jess actually wants to say a couple words, but Agnes said, "Well, I want to be interviewed too." So we were super lucky in that we got to not only learn from Agnes about this piece of artwork and how she interpreted it, but then also work with her as a survivor with her story.
You nailed it. That was exactly what happened. We said, "Can you make some art?" And she said, "Sure, but you're going to interview me too, right?" This piece has been such a conversation point for us over the last couple of years and has been yet another amazing way to invite people to better understand histories of residential and day school in the North. So we thought, why not commission more artwork? Why not invite other survivors to make art that represents their stories, or intergenerational survivors to make art that represent their stories? And so we have sought out funding from a number of different venues, including the NWT Arts Council and the Canada Council for the Arts. We have 7 artists who are survivors or intergenerational survivors who've been commissioned to create art based on their experience. And it's a wide variety of art. So we have someone who's doing digital artwork, a painting, someone who's doing more of an installation, beading, someone is creating a jacket. So very much a multimedia approach. And in addition to, again, giving survivors and intergenerational survivors another way to share a story, so another sort of storytelling methodology, this project is also revitalizing traditions. And it is investing in artists. So we are paying them fairly for this commissioned artwork. They will receive exhibition fees every time the artwork is shown. And so it's a way to, in a practical sense, support survivors and intergenerational survivors. So if you happen to be in Yellowknife between early September and late November, the exhibit will be installed at the Yellowknife Visitor Center. It will will have a virtual version of the exhibit as well, so that it has a wider reach. But we also want to mention this to people because we're really hoping that this exhibit will travel after it's run in Yellowknife. We'd love for it to be seen in other places, in particular in the North, but also outside of the North. And so if this is something that you could do as part of where you live or work, then please reach out. This is another thing that we'd love to talk to people about. So with that, that is the end of our formal presentation. We did have because this is a bit of a different format, we did have some questions that were sent in ahead of time. So we have prepared responses to that, but maybe I'll just pause and see if Heather, if there have been any other questions that you want us to add.
Yeah. Thank you first, before we get into the questions, so much. It was amazing. I feel like I have so many questions, myself, but I will let the people who submitted, be the priority. But I'm really glad that you mentioned, the exhibit, and especially Agnes's drum design, because I was going to ask about that. It's so beautiful. Like you see it on the website and sort of in connection with the podcast. It was nice to kind of hear that story and those details. And thank you for telling us too about the virtual exhibit. I'm going to make sure I'll put a link to the website when I kind of send the follow-up email for this, so that folks can, kind of bookmark that when it's available. And I'll put it in the sort of niche post too when we release the recording. So yeah, so we had a few questions that were submitted when folks originally registered, and we did actually get 8 questions that came in during the talk. So there's a lot, and I'm mindful of time. I won't take more than sort of 10 or 15 minutes. So we're likely not going to get through all of the questions. But I guess we can. I'll start with the ones that were submitted in advance, maybe, and then I'll kind of move through to the kind of new ones. Crystal, did you want to jump in?
Well, I was just going to say we prepared some slides for
Oh,
the ones
perfect.
that were
Great.
submitted. So why don't we just
Awesome.
go through those?
Yeah,
Okay.
perfect.
And then we'll turn it over to you for the new ones. Awesome.
Great.
One of the questions was, how did seasonal weather conditions affect students' recreational activities? Um, as Crystal talked about, there were really different time periods or different experiences based on time period in northern residential schools. So, pre 1950, recreation was largely informal. There was some organized recreation, but that was fairly limited, versus after 1950, when it was very much seen as part of the project of assimilation. And so, greater efforts were made to have organized recreation as part of the school experience. Um, Infrastructure is also really important to answering this question. So, for much of the history in the North, there weren't gymnasiums or playgrounds or playrooms. Those are sort of later additions. And so there was very much a seasonality to children's experiences of recreation at residential school. We heard a little bit of that in Dave's clip in particular. But it's also just because it was cold, it didn't mean kids were not outside doing things. Crystal has a really great, I'm going to give a little plug to a series that we did for Niche, and we're still editing for Niche, called Land Memory and Schooling, about environmental histories of residential and day school. And Crystal has a really great piece in there about climate and residential schooling that talks a little bit about how cold shaped kids' experiences of residential school and recreation. Um, so, and there are other pieces that are part of that series as well, that I think it would be really, we think it would be really beneficial for folks to read, to learn more, and answer that question.
Great, thanks. So the next question that was submitted was, what were some of the ethical considerations with making the podcast? Great question. I think this is one we could talk about extensively, but I will keep it short. And I mean, I think one of the biggest kind of reassurances that Jess and I have in our work every day is knowing that we're guided by this advisory committee that is made up of mostly survivors. And so having a team of people that we can look to, get advice from, sometimes be scolded. I mean, we aren't perfect people either. And the ability to come together, to meet, to talk about hard things, um, that is something that we do and we embrace. The other part is understanding that these folks come with a ton of expertise. Like, they were the ones who survived the system. And some of them have been working decades in these fields. They have thought about many of these questions for almost their whole lives. I often say that, these are the experts on colonization. They are not published, but they have theorized it all. And so also having structures in place where we can compensate them fairly, where we can also offer supports and even programs of cultural revitalization. So when we do get together, make time to learn how to tuft or to bead or get teachings from the land. So this is not just about project management or about podcast production. This is also about cultural and language revitalization. It is about wellness. Staying in touch frequently in order to make sure everyone is okay. is also a part of the ethics. And then with the podcast itself, having an ongoing consent process, working with the people who we interview to undertake transcript review, to making sure they're comfortable with the process, but also having the open mind and the flexibility to be responsive to critiques. If this isn't working for you, how can we adjust or pivot? And this process is guided by not only the NWT-RPA, but also formal ethics approval with the University of Alberta. And then, of course, we also have an NWT research license.
So the next question we got was, how do you think focusing on recreation changes understanding of the residential school system compared to more commonly studied aspects like education, discipline, and abuse? And so this is one I think that we, answered during the presentation, but we wanted to just sort of reiterate that focusing on recreation invites us to acknowledge variety, complexity, and nuance, but not in a way that takes away from or detracts from the harms of residential and day school. So, in the mainstream, recreation can often be used as a way to suggest that there were positives to the residential school system. It wasn't as bad, to counter narratives of genocide and trauma. And we're really careful to never minimize the harms, but also to recognize that Indigenous peoples and communities are more than that harm, and to acknowledge how children at residential school and survivors are using recreation for their own purposes. So that, oh wait, no, there's one more, sorry. Back to Crystal.
Thanks, Jess. Yeah. So the final question that was submitted in advance was, what do you see as the podcast's main contribution to the calls to action? And as Jess and I were talking about these questions earlier this week, we were reminded that actually the 94 calls to action don't specifically address recreation. There is a whole section called Sports and Reconciliation, which cover calls to action 87 through 91. But I mean, more broadly, we generally say that we work in the spirit of the TRC. We are survivor led. We are focused on storytelling. We also pick up the general aim of the TRC, which is meant to educate Canadians about these really hard histories. So particularly because the 10th anniversary has just passed on the 94 calls to action, this is actually a great time to maybe in your workplace or with your team to talk about the last 10 years, what the next 10 years might look like. Are there ways that you can recommit? But I should also point out that this is also a great opportunity to try and better understand how projects like these are engaged in principles of UNDRIP. So taking a look at UNDRIP, reading the articles, and so, for example, like in alignment with Articles 18 and 19 of UNDRIP, Indigenous survivors and intergenerational survivors are central to decision making through the project's advisory committee, and all activities are developed in partnership with governments and communities. So I'm just reading here from like this little blurb that I brainstormed about how UNDRIP is also a part of this work. We've also been able to link it to Article 23 by actively involving Indigenous organizations in the design and delivery. So I understand that that was not the question about UNDRIP, but I think the question about the 94 calls to action really makes some space to think about, okay, what other kinds of bodies of work are out there that we could try to support and directly connect to in the kinds of work that we do.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So two of the questions that came in, you addressed in your slides and in here. So I'm thinking if it's okay with you, maybe we'll do three questions and okay. So the first one that I'll ask is, in your talk, you spoke about sort of a broad definition of recreation, and the kind of the way that you applied it to this project. Why do you think recreation hasn't been talked about as much in residential school history?
Well, I think that it is tricky because when we think about historiographical trends, you know, you can see it in historiography, and so early understandings of residential schools are are primarily archival based. We think about books like A National Crime and Xingua's Vision that came out after or as a result of RCAP. Then, you know, we have the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. We have the apology, the establishment of the TRC. So kind of like this new focus on survivor-led work and storytelling. But also embedded in the TRC was a compensation process and a statement gathering process. And you know, the TRC is still fairly recent, but because of the compensation and kind of legal nature of that engagement, um, you know, a lot of stories of harm and violence and under the bigger umbrella of genocide were shared. You know, now that it's been 10 years since the TRC wrapped up, we've had other hard questions about child death, about unmarked graves, etc. But we also see this gradual shift in nation-led projects um, that are using new lenses of strength and resilience. And so you know, in other places, I've talked about the work of Eve Tuck that she has called a moratorium on damage-centered research. If you are Indigenous and you're working with your community, that we need to have more of a nation-building focus. And so I think as a result of all of this, we are just learning more. We are seeing more nuance and complexity in these kinds of stories that survivors are feeling supported enough, and they're also the space is being made where we can talk about sport and recreation, which sometimes was a good thing. Sometimes it was a very violent thing. So I think we're just in a different sort of space now that is allowing these stories to come out. And I mean, we do have to say that before How I Survived, there was already an excellent group of historians working on these topics and thinking of Alan Downey, Janice Forsyth, and others. Yeah, thanks. Did you want to add anything to that, Jess?
Nope,
No.
you nailed it.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think that yeah, it totally makes sense that you know, at a time now where likely it feels a little more secure that you can talk about these things without it potentially undermining the wider experience. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I'm happy that you listed some names there too. If anyone listening wants to kind of read up on you know, other kind of areas or other realms of like sport and recreation, there's a lot of really good work out there. So one of the other questions is, what kind of conversations do you hope that this podcast starts, especially among people who, you know, feel like they already kind of know everything or understand everything about residential schools? It's one of those big questions.
Totally. Um, I, it's interesting. Whenever we sort of get asked, like, what do you want to come out of the podcast? And my response is less about the conversations that I want people to ask and more about I want um, people to listen. Because you may think you know, but you don't. You know, we've been working on this project for 8 years. I am not a historian of education or the North or residential school. I came to this project as a historian of recreation in a Southern, you know, colonial settler context. And yet I have been listening to these stories now for years. And every time I listen to either a story from a new person or re-listen to a story through one of the episodes that we've recorded, I am learning. Um, and so, you know, I really think I want people to listen and to keep listening, and to remain open to not knowing and not understanding, and 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 then taking direction from. So one of the things that we ask survivors, as part of the interview experiences, what do you want people to learn or take away, or what do you want them to know? And in particular, we say recreation leaders because it is a podcast about recreation, and we want to be able to contribute to that field as well, like people on the ground who are practitioners. And so survivors have direction, they have things that they want people to know. And so I think, especially like listening to the stories, but also listen to the guidance that you're given by the survivors in the episodes, and then do your best to put that into practice. So I guess I want people to listen and then do, as guided by survivors rather than talk.
Right. Yeah. Crystal, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I agree.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, so the last one, and maybe in some ways it kind of connects actually to your response to the previous question, but why did you decide that a podcast was sort of the best way to tell these stories instead of, a book or an article or a more sort of traditional medium?
Well, me and Jess just both start smiling because, you know, like many good projects, it did not start as a podcast. We were actually very inspired. So let me back up a minute, saying that like we always wanted to engage with the public. This was never exclusively a scholarly project. And so back in 2018, 2019, we were thinking, how can we do this, especially in the North? And we were very inspired by a traveling museum exhibit on the special constables in the North. And so that was kind of what we set out to do, was to create a little museum exhibit that could be packed up in a hockey bag and put on a plane and travel to communities. Um, then COVID happened and a number of other things, which meant delays. But we were still able to do some interviews, and we came together at an advisory committee meeting a couple of years ago, and said, the traveling exhibit is still at a standstill. These are all of the challenges. Um, how can we honor these stories? Because like we shouldn't be the guardians of these stories. Like they were told in order to be shared with other people. And the advisory committee decided that a podcast was a good idea. Um, so that's how we decided on the podcast. Maybe I'll turn it over to Jess to add anything else. No? Yeah.
You're just so good.
Um, yeah, it's great. I love that. I love this sort of origin story, right? It's funny. So many things around this timeline. COVID comes up and it either throws things off completely or is in a weird way, a contributing factor to something working out how it should, like an odd sense. And I mean, looking at the numbers of downloads, like 3,000 downloads, that suggests that this actually is reaching a really wide audience and probably wider than if it was an exhibit. Not that but you're kind of doing that too. Like you're kind of joining the podcast with the virtual exhibit and the in-person exhibit. So you're gonna kind of get the best of both worlds in that sense.
That's
Um,
true. And we always kind of joke that Me and Jess are there to take our marching orders from the
Yeah.
advisory committee, and so we do have the first season done. The second season is underway. Jess and I have also like published some scholarly outputs about the project, but we also have an advisory committee meeting coming up in 3 weeks, and so we're like, oh,
Yeah.
what is next?
We always leave those meetings with a very long list of things to do.
Yeah,
Gratefully.
I
Yeah.
believe it. Yeah, I'm sure there's like so many legs for this to like keep going and going, but it's like for for anybody that is in the kind of Zoom and hasn't listened to the podcast yet, definitely check it out. There's so much, like it's so rich. It's like you said, there are heartbreaking elements to it, but there's also really beautiful elements. There are funny elements. It is sort of it captures the kind of range of human human experience, human kind of coping mechanisms in a lot of ways with this history. But yeah. Okay, well I don't want to take up too much. I could ask so many questions, but I won't. But yes, thank you again so much for giving the talk this year. It was great to hear. And Glenn, thank you for introducing our speakers today. And yeah, I will when we kind of release the recording of the talk, I'll make sure all the kind of links to the project and to the various aspects of it are in there so people can, kind of explore further. But yeah, I mean, in the meantime, it's easy to find. Just Google it and you'll find it. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Heather. Thank you all so much. Yeah, it's been really nice to give the lecture this year.